All right, there's a color revolution going on here in the United States, and that is so important to understand because that's the way countries fall, and they're following that playbook. It's happening. We have to follow the money. It's not going to be easy. In fact, it was designed to be as dark as possible. I want to show you a spreadsheet here, recently shared by Congresswoman Luna. This allegedly is the financial trail behind No Kings. Over $294 million in total. The money trail comes from the who's who of left-wing activism. $45 million from Tide, $72 million from Soros, Rockefeller, Ford, Buffett, and $79 million from Arabella advisors. You've seen these names over and over again. Doesn't surprise me. But that's a lot of money. And the funds are spread all over the place. And it's a headache to track it down, but it's supposed to be. So I wanted to bring in a big gun because this guy has brought clarity over finances for a very long time. He is the best of the best. He's the president of the Government Accountability Institute, been tracking this kind of stuff forever. He is the author of multiple New York Times best-selling books. Peter Schweizer joins us now. Peter, have you seen this latest, and I know this disagrees with some of your work, have you seen the latest number of $294 million going to No Kings?
Yeah, I have, Glenn. And in fact, the spreadsheet that Congressman Luna shared is a spreadsheet that Seamus Bruner, our vice president at GAI, put together. So I'm glad she put it out there. Yeah, the numbers continue to mount. And the reason, Glenn, is you touched on it in your introduction. Tracing this money is very hard. Sometimes the money goes through pass-throughs. Sometimes the money is donated anonymously. Sometimes the money is crowdfunded. So yeah, the numbers are going to continue to climb. The more we find details on the specific trails. So, I mean, 294, over $250 million. I assume that's not just for this, that's to fund the whole thing and what's still yet to come. An astounding number. How clearly can we trace it to the actual movement itself, the ground operation? Yeah, so what that spreadsheet shows is that, let's say something like the Tides Foundation gives $20 million to an organization. That could be for general funds, that could be for anything. But if that organization is playing an active central role in these protests, they are included in the database. And the problem, Glenn, as you know, is money is fungible. So you could have a Ford Foundation, for example, funding an organization on something to, let's say, get out the vote. But that money can be used also for protests. And I think the way that we need to understand this is it's not just about the No Kings movement. They are creating and have created an infrastructure to create social disintegration or social destabilization in the United States. Many of the same groups behind No Kings are the same organizations that were engaged in more violent protests during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, or when in October of 23, when Hamas brutally attacked Israel and all the protesters came out in favor of Palestine. It's many of those same organizations. That's why we have sort of jokingly, but only half jokingly, called this Riot Incorporated, because they have an infrastructure for social destabilization. It includes the group on that list. What it does not include, Glenn, are the foreign entities that are also involved in this movement in places like China and Iran, etc. I mean, it is stunning, Peter, that's a lot of money. $300 million, that's a good-sized company. It's amazing to me that kind of money can be swimming in our streets and nobody really understands it. When you look at the crowds that came out this weekend, what is the percentage of people that have any idea how badly they're being used? Oh, that's a great question. Obviously, it depends city by city. I think in a place like New York or San Francisco, it's probably a higher percentage are aware of what's going on because you have a lot of professional activists there. Same thing in Portland, Oregon. But I would say if you look nationwide, I would guess maybe 20 to 25% know what's actually going on. I mean, let's remember these protesters in some cases are standing next to other protesters that have a sign from PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. This is an organization that communes with the Chinese Communist Party. They travel there, they coordinate with them. They say their program is the party of the Chinese Communist Party. There have been some reports that there are financial ties there. I would imagine that there are a fair number of people at these protests that have no idea that the people that are protesting next to them are tied to our foreign adversary, namely the Chinese Communist Party.
Do you see anything that you look at and say, this is actionable? This is something the government can actually do something about?
Yeah, I think the key thing is when you're looking at violent protests, what's very interesting to me, Glenn, is that the protests, the recent No Kings, the No Kings 2.0 protests, not a lot of violent activity. I honestly believe part of the reason is the president had a meeting in the White House, a very public meeting about violent protests. And part of that discussion was who's funding them and Department of Justice looking at entities that are funding violent protests. That's the reason I think we didn't see a lot here at No Kings 2.0 because of the deterrent factor, because there is actually a pathway. If you are a businessman, if you are a foundation, if you are an individual and you are funding an organization that is known to engage in criminal activity, meaning violent protest, arson, attacking police officers, etc., you could be potentially charged under RICO and other statutes. So I think the president voicing concerns about this, saying that DOJ is looking into it, is having a deterrent effect because while a lot of these, let's say, esteemed or publicly acknowledged foundations have a sort of revolutionary attitude, they don't want to go to jail. They don't want to be prosecuted. They don't want to be charged. So I think it is having a deterrent effect to have this conversation, and I think that's very good and healthy.
So a lot of these, a couple Wednesdays ago, we did an episode. We just laid down some easy things, and their argument will be, I'm only doing things that are protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. So I'm not doing we're not giving our money to any of the violence, any of that. How do you get there, Peter?
Well, you get there a couple of ways. First of all, a lot of these organizations are outright open in their advocacy for violent protests. They use words like direct action. That's a term from the left, which means violent engagement. You see a lot of times in their literature things like holding signs is not enough. Okay, well then what are you saying besides holding signs at these protests? What I would say that the Department of Justice should be doing is a couple of things. Number one, following the money. We provided that information, all public sourced, all public record from tax returns, et cetera, to the Department of Justice. Number two, looking at the communication. I think they should subpoena the communication records because if you have some of these businessmen, some of these foundations that are communicating with organizations that have a history of violent protest, and they are aware that there may be violent protests, that is the very definition of a RICO charge. RICO was set up during the time of high organized crime because the police and law enforcement were tired of busting the guy on the street corner who's committing the violent act, but not being able to get to the guy who's actually financing it and organizing it. The same parallel would apply here. So I think that's what you need to do is you need to look at communication. You had actions in Georgia in this entity called Stop Cop City, where you literally had organizations that were funded by the Tides Foundation. We've established that. These organizations were throwing Molotov cocktails. They were assaulting police officers. And the local prosecutors who, by the way, were Democrats, charged these protesters with RICO and also with domestic terrorism charges. The question I would have is, did the Tides Foundation know the history of this organization? Did they communicate? Did they know what was planned? Because this was a very public act that was planned and discussed, that they were going to engage in these violent protests. That, to me, is the very definition of where you could prosecute somebody.
So could you explain for people who don't remember the Tides Foundation? What is it? How do they work?
Yeah, so the Tides Foundation is a grant-giving foundation, meaning that they give money to nonprofit organizations. They show up quite frequently on the database that we attended. The challenge with the Tides Foundation is they receive donations from people in Silicon Valley. Mark Benioff, the founder and CEO of Salesforce, has donated to them. Then the Tides Foundation takes this donated money and then doles it out to these various organizations. So if you're Mark Benioff, you can probably, I think, very legitimately say, I don't know who Tides is giving the money to. Tides made that determination. So it allows the Tides Foundation, in a sense, to screen people from the consequences of where the money might be going. Again, I have no idea if Mark Benioff or Bill Gates or the many other people that have given to the Tides Foundation are aware that they were going for violent protests, but Tides is at the center of a lot of this, and that's why I think the investigation needs to start there. And again, if these large investors, these well-known philanthropists are giving money to Tides and they have any inkling that it's going for violent action, they should be held into account as well.
So I talked about this, last week before. It was a Saturday. I get a call from the FBI on my wife's phone. Mrs. Beck, is your husband around? We're with the FBI. We would like to send some agents over to the house to talk to your husband. And she looks at me and I'm like, what? What's happening? And so they came over to the house and there were 3 of them. And I said, are you a good witch or a bad witch? I wouldn't necessarily welcome you from the DOJ, from the last administration, but come on in. They said they just wanted to gather some information, some things that we had talked about and the things that we had looked at. I was really shocked, Peter. I felt bad for the people who are actually fighting this fight, because you and I have talked about this stuff for 20 years. They haven't heard of it. No one in the Department of Justice has done any legwork on this in 20 years. Because they have just been ignoring it and turning a blind eye. And then when the Republicans get in, they get in for 4 years, and they weren't taking it seriously enough. How difficult is it for the FBI to be able to start from scratch and be able to get these people?
Yeah, no, it shouldn't be that difficult, but I agree with you. It's all about the priorities of the people at the top.
Yeah.
And 20 years ago, obviously, there was a lot of focus on Islamist terrorism, et cetera. I understand that, but, they devoted their resources to going after Catholics in Richmond, Virginia.
Right.
Rather than these radical organizations. And what's very encouraging to me about all of this, Glenn, is, look, you and I both know there's a lot of information, a lot of exaggerated stuff out there on this subject that has no credible information. I've known you for a long time. The research that you guys do, everything's verifiable. Everything is sourced. You can hand it over and say, here's where we got the information. It's all credible. We work the same way. So I think it's very encouraging that the FBI is reaching out. They're reaching out to people to have this information, and we can help them move along this process much quicker than they would if they were trying to develop this organically. As you said before, this is a tangled web.
I know. I brought your name up. I said, if you guys aren't talking to Peter Schweizer, you've got. Have they contacted you? Or have you?
We have had contact. We have had contact with the FBI. I'm still curious, by the way, that they called your wife's phone.
Because I don't have a phone, and we talked about it. We're like, how did they get this phone number? But it's the FBI. I will tell you, Peter. I gave them the name of a few people, and I said, look, this is what they do. I said, we have archives and stuff we can show you. But these people are on it every single day, and I'm glad that you have reached out to them or they have reached out to you, because I like I said, I actually felt really bad for them because they could have told me everybody who has seen a Latin mass in the last 5 years, but they could not tell me anything. And they really are, I mean, you could tell the administration is pushing and they want to respond and have some names. Here in Texas, you know, they're going to start prosecuting some people, and they need the money connections. As they said, if we can track money and connect it, then the whole thing starts to come down. So, Peter, I want to go through a couple of names. Zuckerberg, his organization's funneled $50+ million into Riot, Inc., as you call it. And he did it through Arabella. We have that big investor or, funder from overseas. Weiss, I think is his name. What's his first name? He's from the Swiss area of the world. We have Bill Gates, another $100 million, again through Arabella. But these guys are all really smart. I mean, you're not a billionaire and not know how to funnel money in a way that is not going to come back to you with any problems. Do you think we're going to be able to crack this code with people like Soros or people like Gates? Because that's where the real money is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say it's going to be easy, but look, I think it's absolutely the step we need to take, because it's one thing to increase enforcement on the street level, which we absolutely have to do. I mean, if you assault an ICE officer, if you're trying to firebomb an ICE facility in Portland, Oregon, you absolutely should be charged. But let's be completely blunt here. I mean, this is, to use an analogy with the mafia, those people are disposable. What you really want to get to are the people that are organizing these protests, who are providing the communications equipment, who are providing the logistics support, who are providing the legal support to what they're doing. And that means you've got to work your way up the food chain. Do these guys like Zuckerberg and Gates, everything they do they engage lawyers? Do they use institutions to shield themselves from possible liability, whether it's in business or their philanthropy? Absolutely. But the bottom line is there is somebody, and I would say it's with some of these foundations and some of these advisory firms that are acting as the pass-throughs, know exactly what they're doing when they donate this money. When they're giving it to the organizations down in Georgia with Stop Cop City, they know what they're doing because they talk about it month after month, year after year. And those are the people that need to be held into account. And again, to use the mafia analogy, Glenn, you can try to work your way up the food chain. You could ask somebody who's at one of these entities, okay, you are communicating with this organization engaged in violent acts. Who directed you to do it? And if you don't want to tell us, that's fine. We're going to throw the book at you. That's how I think you need to approach it. I never come and say, whether it's when you and I talked about the Bidens or the Clintons, I never say that this stuff is easy. It isn't easy, but it's a worthwhile endeavor that has to be done. And whether it's legal charges or greater clarity on what's been going on, it's absolutely something that's necessary for our country. Because look, we are in an era of American history where social cohesion is being challenged by large funders and entities that wish us ill. Some of them are domestic, some of them are overseas, and we have to expose this in a consistent way.
Let me go to overseas here for a second. Let's start with China. What do we know about China?
Well, we know there are a couple of people that are involved in funding what I would regard as radical movements in the United States. The trans rights movement, which has emerged kind of out of nowhere, really. Who's talking about this 10 years ago? Two of the biggest funders of the trans rights movements are Chinese billionaires. One of them is Joe Tsai, the chairman of Alibaba, which is kind of the Amazon of China. He's given tens of millions of dollars to trans causes in the United States.
Which, by the way,
he does not fund trans rights in China itself.
Right. Which I wanted to ask you about, Peter.
Interesting.
That says something. He either believes it and is afraid to do it in China, or he doesn't believe it, but he knows it'll set us on fire. Which do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I would think that if he was passionate about this, he would be consistent. and he would be pushing it in China as well, but he's not. And of course, the situation with regards to the LGBTQ whatever community in China is much more dire than it's ever been in the United States. So Joe Tsai would be an example of somebody in that particular area. The trans rights movement has funded those causes. The other one that I would point to in China is Roy Singham. Now, Roy Singham is an American, but very interesting, Glenn. He had a tech company called ThoughtWorks. He sold it in 2017 for $1 billion, made him a billionaire. What's interesting is the investment firm that bought ThoughtWorks from him is partly owned by the Sovereign Wealth Fund of China, which I find very interesting. But when he cashes in, he leaves the United States. He now lives in Beijing, China, where if you look at the Chinese media and other reports, he is very chummy with the CCP. He attends CCP events, etc. He considers himself a Maoist. He always has. He is not only involved in supporting the trans rights movement in the United States, every sort of, violent, agitated protests in the United States, you can look and see that Roy Singham has been connected in some way. And that's because he's got an entity in New York called the People's Forum. He poured $160 million into it. And the People's Forum has been sort of ground center for the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, the so-called anti-Israel or pro-Palestine protests beginning in 2023. A lot of them originated or organized within the People's Forum. And now, of course, the No Kings protests and the protests by other organizations. So he is very actively involved, in my mind, in destabilizing in the United States. And he's done this in other countries like India, where his entities have faced legal peril because they say that he's essentially trying to subvert the state of India.
So, the same thing with George Soros, but nobody seems to act. I don't know why we allow George Soros just to continue to do this. He's been banned in, 3 countries around the world for doing exactly this. Peter, when you look at, let's stay overseas for a second. When you look at what's happening in Europe, it's the same exact playbook happening in country after country, all Western countries. But Europe is still headed in the wrong direction. They don't have anybody willing to stand up against this. Are any of these players financially tied to Europe? Do you know? Are they doing any of that? Is that a whole new separate group of funding for Europe? And are they too far gone?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've got family in Europe. My mother was from Sweden, my father from Switzerland, so I track events there pretty closely. What's interesting to me is you see kind of almost a division of responsibility or duty by these radical groups. In the United States, we've discussed kind of in detail the funding, how they operate, the issues they've latched onto. When it comes to Europe, it's almost entirely an issue related to Islam and Muslim communities. And that's because that's what the demographics show. You have a situation in Europe, whether it's Sweden, where my mother's from, or the situation in France or Italy, where much of the base of the institutional opposition to what I would call Western civilization comes from specific ethnic or religious community, which is Islamist. And that model has worked in places like the UK. You've covered this extensively. Mm-hmm. Some of these local governments now that are essentially run by Islamists. And I think you're seeing a kind of a replay of that, an attempted replay of that in New York. With the Mamdani campaign.
Yes, and Texas is in real trouble. Mamdani is, that looks like it could happen in England or France. But the number one seeming destination for Islamists seems to be Texas right now.
Yeah, And they look for opportunities to build out what they call civilizational jihad. And the notion, if you look at the literature, you've talked about this as well, Glenn, if you look at the literature, they don't need to be a demographic majority. They talk extensively about how people don't really vote in local elections. So all we need to do is have our core base and make sure they turn out and vote. And we can take over a local government with, 9 or 11% of the population. And once they have that base of local government, what does it allow them to do? It allows them to create local statutes and laws, but even more importantly, they now have a financial base upon which they can operate. They get federal grants, they get state grants, they raise money locally, and they can steer that money in a manner that moves towards their ultimate goal, which is this sort of civilizational victory over the Judeo-Christian West, as they put it. So it's a very serious and real problem. I think for Europe, it's a bigger problem because the demographics there are much more dire than they are in the United States. Mm-hmm. But there's no doubt they are trying to replicate that in New York City and in areas of Texas and parts of California.
And Dearborn, Michigan, and Minneapolis. I mean, it's crazy what's happening. Peter, hold on. We have one more break together, and want to get some more information on what exactly is happening. Peter, over the years, you've come to me with books on the Clintons and the Bidens and the right as well. And you have said at times, this is such an obvious, shocking case. How tough is this case to prove?
I think it's very hard to prove legally, but again, I think it's an effort worth taking. Anytime you're dealing with somebody who is sophisticated, who is wealthy, who is successful, you have to realize that you're facing a very monumental legal battle. But this is the way our system is supposed to work. And that's why I've always done what you've done, Glenn, which is follow the money, look at what the law says, look at what the details are, and based on that, argue what action should be taken. And I don't see, unless we are prepared to tolerate going forward, that we are going to have permanent disruption in our streets, that when federal law enforcement officers are simply trying to enforce the law like ICE is trying to do, you're going to have people targeting them. You're going to have local law enforcement shielding them. You're going to have organized protests consistently helping people to evade being held accountable for violating federal law. Unless we're prepared to accept that, this is the necessary step to take. And what they're counting on, the people that are funding this and organizing this, what they're counting on is that we don't have the attention span, we don't have the capability to expose it, and we don't have the fortitude to actually do something about it. And I think they're wrong. I think I'm seeing a lot of energy in Washington, D.C. I'm very encouraged and excited about it. We'll wait and see what's done, but I think it's absolutely necessary for the future of the country.
I mean, at some point, it's the Insurrection Act, isn't it? At some point, if you can say that they are funding these organizations that are trying to overthrow the stability of the United States, that's a whole different ballgame. And the rules change when that happens.
Yeah, the rules do change. And look, it's interesting to me that going back to January 6th, how eager so many people on the left were to say, this is insurrection. We're going to use the Insurrection Act. We're going to use all of these sort of political crimes based on an event where, sure, there were people that hit cops and trespassed and did things they shouldn't do. But this was not an organized effort to overthrow the government. But they wanted to use this act somehow to do that. What we are dealing with in this particular case is not a individual incident where there was excess and people made some dumb mistakes. What we're talking about is an organized, consistent effort that has been taking place now over the course of several years that is using violent weapons, things like Molotov cocktails. Law enforcement officers have been shot. This is much more of a clear-cut case of the Insurrection Act than anything ever related to January 6th was. So if they are prepared to be honest about it, which they're not, they would recognize that this is the clear insurrection we're talking about, not what happened on January the 6th.
Peter, I only have about 80 seconds. Can you talk to me a little bit about NGOs that maybe were getting money from the government? Have you found any evidence of that? This is what USAID does all around the world, is this kind of thing. Are we seeing any government money going to any of this?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you right now, Glenn, we're working on a research project. I don't have the final details yet. I'm glad to come by and talk to you about it when we are. But actually, the tens of millions of taxpayer dollars in the United States right now, that are going to radical Islamist groups. I was shocked about it as well, but I mean, tens of millions of dollars going to radical Islamist groups. These are Islamist groups where the leaders, call Jews cockroaches, that talk about the need to overthrow Western civilization. So yes, we are finding that.
Peter, as always, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.